That's the jolly opening to the last movement of Haydn's 104th Symphony, showing clearly the relationship between the very simple melodies and harmonies that Haydn's music is often based on and the folk music that would have been common at the time. And that's a link that becomes even more evident when you listen to this Croatian folk song. The exact relationship between those two pieces of music is lost in the mists of time. But it's clear that Haydn knew this piece as a folk melody, or thought of it as a folk melody, because of the way that he presents it. It starts off very simple over a drone, as it may well be in its original setting, and with no other real accompaniment apart from that drone, just a simple tune and the drone underneath. But what's really interesting is that although the material is accessible and simple and folk-like, what Haydn does with it over the course of this movement is incredibly sophisticated. And it's that pairing of accessibility and simplicity with complexity and sophistication that's the hallmark of the mature classical period, and particularly the hallmark of composers like Haydn. As in the other videos in this series, I'm going to give an overview of the whole movement and just pick out a few interesting features before playing the whole movement along with an annotated score. Like the first movement of this symphony, the last movement is in sonata form, meaning there's an exposition in which tonic and dominant ideas are presented, then a development which takes that material, develops it and modulates to a range of different keys, and then a recapitulation in which all the original material is brought back, but this time in the tonic. Also, like the first movement, this is a monothematic sonata form, which means that the first subject, S1 on this diagram, is used pretty much again the same for the second subject, S2, one basic theme. The difference this time, however, is that Haydn makes quite a bit more effort to differentiate the two subjects. You can see at the beginning, although it's actually a little harder to hear, that in the second violin there's a little counter melody. And one of the ways in which Haydn makes the first subject and the second subject seem more different is that in bar 54, when the material all comes back, that counter melody is much more prominent than it was the time before. So here's the counter melody snuck in at bar 11. You can hardly really notice it. Whereas here, in the second subject, at bar 55, you can hardly hear anything else but that little counter melody. It's almost a bit of a cheat compared to the first movement. It is monothematic, there is basically one theme, but that one theme is always accompanied by this counter melody, and the counter melody almost becomes like the second theme in the second subject because it's so much more prominent, whereas the first subject has the main theme as being more prominent. Haydn also does something else to differentiate his second subject group, and that is to include a second subject labelled S2B. And you can see from this little excerpt of the score and hear that it is very contrasting, particularly rhythmically. It's worth taking a look at the second subject, S2B, because not only does it provide some contrast within this monothematic sonata form structure, but it also introduces an important delaying mechanism that we see occurring elsewhere in this movement, namely an interrupted cadence that delays the final arrival on the dominant for the codetta at the end of the exposition.
In bar 83, Haydn ends on an E7 chord, an E dominant 7th chord, 5 in A major. And we'd expect that, obviously, to resolve to 1. Now, it's a very common gesture in classical music to, instead of resolving a chord 5 like that to 1, interrupting it by going to 6, an interrupted cadence. And that's sort of what Haydn does here. So you'd expect that to go from chord 5 to chord 6 like this. But Haydn has another set of surprises and delays up his sleeve. So instead of landing on an ordinary F sharp minor chord, which is what chord 6 would be, he lands on this chord instead. Which is much more surprising than... So the difference in bar 84 is that we've got an A sharp and an E, an added 7th as well. So what we've actually got is a new dominant 7th chord, an F sharp dominant 7th chord, which implies B minor. And that's in fact where he goes next. So we have the F sharp dominant 7th in bar 84 and 5. And then in bar 86 we go to B minor. And that turns out to be part of a perfectly ordinary circle of fifths. In fact, back through an E chord in bar 88 and 89 to more or less chord 1 in bar 90, an A major chord. Although actually he blurs that a bit with some passing minims in the inner parts. So it actually goes like this. And so he defers really resolving it really well until a little bit later, in fact. But the main thing that's going on here is bar 83 dominant 7th, and then this very unusual interrupted cadence that is a secondary dominant. In bar 85 there's an extra note again before it resolves where he adds this G, so we've got a dominant 7th chord like this. He adds that G natural, which makes it a really scrunchy added minor 9th instead. So all sorts of things going on there to really delay the resolution of that original dominant 7th in bar 83. Instead of that, and so on it goes.
So now let's listen to the whole sequence that we've just been talking about. Interrupted cadences, which figure so prominently in S2B, become even more important at the end of the development.
Normally you would expect at the end of a development section for there to be a really clear dominant in the home key, so we're going back to D major here, so you would expect perhaps an A dominant 7th ready to resolve onto D, and etc. But that's not the chord that Haydn's on at the end of the development. In fact, at bar 185 he's in the wrong key altogether. He's doing this. F sharp minor, because E sharp's the sharpest sharp, and we're hanging around on the dominant of that key. So at the end of page 83, bar 185 to the end of the page, we've got what sounds like gearing up for perfect cadence in F sharp minor. And then presumably he's going to resolve to 1. What he actually does is a really bit of devilish cunning. So he's sitting on this C sharp chord 5, and just like before, instead of getting chord 1, we get chord 6. So it resolves to a D major chord, because chord 6 in minor keys is always major. So it goes like this. So that's all pretty typical classical stuff, again, using interrupted cadences. But the cunning thing here is that that D major chord that he's landed on is in fact the tonic. We're back at the recapitulation. So rather than going there from an ordinary dominant, so from an A dominant, what he does instead is he's hanging around on this dominant of F sharp minor. And then from there, we have an interrupted cadence onto D instead. So he's really messing around with our expectations. Really vintage late Haydn, getting his lulls in the last movement there, just going into the recapitulation.
Before we listen to the whole movement, I just want to look at the motivic and thematic aspect of this piece. You can see in the diagram here the main motivic elements, and I've labelled them with a mixture of letters and descriptions to make them ally as closely as possible with the published Eduqas analysis. You can see that there's a main theme and then a W and X motif that immediately come after that, and then the counter melody with Y motif that becomes important, as I'll discuss in a minute. And then just skipping on a little bit, you can see a little bit later on in bar 44, some of those elements are combined to make a new theme that Eduqas call Z. Another little detail worth noting is that in the codetta in bar 102, Haydn rather cleverly takes the main idea and contracts it, or rhythmically puts it into diminution so that it goes bum ba-da-dum ba-da-dum, so it becomes a much more lively little closing idea with which to finish off the first section of the movement.
Haydn uses motifs so intensively in this movement that it's impossible to cover them all in this video, but I do just want to trace the development of one particular motif as it develops throughout the course of the movement. So I'm picking on motif Y, which first appears in bar 13 as part of a counter melody. In fact, it's hardly even audible really the first time it comes, just played very quietly in the second violin, while the first violin and the oboe play the main theme. So the main theme above it is going. But underneath there's this little counter melody going on in the second violin, which you'll notice is in contrary motion. And then the little Y motif comes in here. Just a little run of 5 quavers down, very simple, but Haydn makes so much use of it in the rest of the movement. And it's worth noticing, even at this stage, that the Y motif is in contrary motion as well, with the rise in fifth, although it's not filled in by passing notes, in the main tune. So the main tune goes, and the Y motif goes like that. In the second subject, this little motif, along with the whole counter melody, is used more prominently, as I've already mentioned. But once he's got the initial playing of that material out the way in the second subject, the next thing he does is intensively develop this little 5-note idea. So you can see in bar 65 we get the descending 5 notes, and then in the next bar he inverts it, and then he sequences that idea, and and then he continues to use that little fragment of the counter melody, that little motif, for the rest of that page. On the next page, we see something very Haydn-esque and very clever. So what he does is, he takes that idea, which he's now really clearly marked as being an important one, and he incorporates it into material that otherwise would seem quite generic. If you look in the string parts on page 69, starting in bar 73, it's just pretty much just scales going up and down. But now we've had this 5-note idea marked as important, then it clearly references it in both its original form and its inverted form. So in the first violin in bar 73 we get, and you'll notice, as in the first appearance of this idea, in the second violin we have the same thing going on in inversion, so we get contramotion just like we did originally, like that. Which otherwise would seem quite generic material, but Haydn has marked this material, this Y motif, as being important by repeating it so intensively on the previous page. And that's even more true towards in the last 2 bars of the page, where Haydn just has scales going up and down in contramotion, but because both contramotion and this scalic idea have already been made very important, then even this little scalic idea is clearly related to the original motif. Just a scale, but now a scale that is motivic. The final transformation of this motif appears in the last few pages. Here we see what started off as an incredibly quiet and almost inaudible idea, introduced as a counter melody, being almost the most prominent thing going on in the full woodwind played in octave unison. And what's interesting as well is that generally speaking, this motif has spanned a diminished fifth, which makes it quite unstable. It can't be harmonised by anything other than some sort of diminished chord, or a dominant seventh perhaps. But here, at the end of the work, we get a perfect fifth version of it, and it's rising, so it could hardly be a bigger transformation from this little counter melody idea, hardly noticeable, to at the end here, rising, confident, covering a perfect fifth. Again, quite generic, but made so special in this movement by Haydn.
There's so much going on in this movement that you could fill several videos with all the details, but I'm going to move on now to playing through the whole movement with the score, flicking along, showing the overview of the structure and some of the details as they unfold. You can probably benefit by having a hard copy of the score to hand while you're watching it, and of course you can pause the video and make sure you know what's going on and look at a more detailed annotated score if you need to clarify anything.